Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 340 of Humanity Rising. Today, we want to contemplate, in a spirit of deep inquiry, probably the greatest mystery of life, and that is that all life dies and is transformed into something we intuit is there, but none of us can discern with certainty. So like life, being born is a great mystery. Living is a great mystery. The stars above, the extraordinary intricacy of the cosmos is a great mystery. And then this passage at the end of life is perhaps the deepest mystery of all. Just yesterday, we announced the passing of Avon Madison, a great crusader for world peace, who passed at 11:08 in the evening, the night before. And when that happens, somehow the body becomes inert, and the soul and the spirit, where does it really go? So today we have the great privilege and honor to be talking with Raymond Moody, whose work about 40 years ago, Life After Life, really woke up the global scientific community, Western civilization, along with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, to the deep reality of death, but also a discernment into some of the aspects that are, in fact, within the realm of human understanding. So we'll be talking with Ray in a few minutes. But before we do that, let us pause, as we always do at the beginning of all of our Humanity Rising sessions, and let us just center ourselves in our bodies. Take a breath, close our eyes, and attune ourselves to our hearts. And for the next minute or so, let us listen to our heartbeats in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that in this instant, we're alive. All of us are vitally alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I want to begin our program by just noting that when I was a young man who came of age in the 1960s, I had the good fortune of reading Life After Life. And I remember as I was reading it, I was completely startled because I'd never really thought about death much. I was the son of a Christian missionary, and I was taught that you just kind of lived, and when you died, you either went to heaven or you went to hell, depending on whether you believed in Jesus. And that was sort of the end of the matter. And there was no more discussion or even speculation. And in fact, speculating was considered superstitious and sort of the devil. And then along came this book that opened up before my eyes and for the world this notion that death is far more mysterious than we can imagine, and that people have near-death experiences where they think they die and their spirit goes up and they watch the doctors operating on them down in the operating room, and then they come back, and there's all kinds of parallel universes that one can go into around this great mystery. So I've been tracking Ray Moody for a very, very long time, and I had the great pleasure of meeting him, about 15 years ago, and he became a faculty member of Ubiquity and taught courses. And we even did a pilgrimage together to Greece in about 2009, where we went to the Asclepion of Greece, where they had the great healing center, and we explored the caves that they went into for days at a time. And then we went into Northeast Greece into a necromantian that I think we'll talk about in the course of this hour together. But Ray Moody has become a friend. I've read virtually all of his books, and we've had many conversations about these mysteries. So it's a pleasure, Ray, to welcome you on Humanity Rising. And I think it would be a good place to start, just to tell people about your early life and how you came to start to study these matters surrounding near-death experiences and the phenomenon of death. And that'll open up our conversation, and then we'll go from there. But welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It was just so good to be with you. And I was thinking about, you when you've told me before about your very rich religious background in childhood, and the same conversation I mentioned that I had none at all. Right, my dad was a military officer and also a surgeon and a medic in World War II in the Pacific Theater. And when I was a kid, all I knew was that he was just sarcastic about religion and kind of laughed at people. And at the time, I just didn't think about it. But now thinking back, I can kind of realize, no doubt what he saw in the Pacific just, it turned him off on religion, I gather. And so I really astronomy was my thing. And I always wanted to be an astronomer and a comedian. That's what I said when I was a kid. So I went to the University of Virginia at age 18. And at that time, if you would have asked me about the notion of an afterlife, I would have just assumed that it was a joke. My only experience with it was in cartoons. My father subscribed to the New York magazine, some other magazines, but occasionally there would be a cartoon portraying the pearly gates with angels and so on. And to me, that was my context. So fully determined to be an astronomer, but I also was interested in philosophy. So my first semester, I took a philosophy course at the University of Virginia and was hooked. And we read Plato's Republic, and just first couple of days in college, remember exactly where on the page, first few pages of the Republic. I'm going to be a philosophy major. And the Republic is a very dramatic work that sort of culminates in this near-death experience. This warrior was believed dead on the battlefield. And I remember my exact association. Number one, what a surprise. And also, it was a jarring experience to me that somebody who was already my hero, even by that time, Plato, was obviously interested in life after death, which I thought was a joke. So that was kind of rattled me. And I remember asking Professor Hammond about this, and he said, yeah, these early Greek philosophers studied cases of people who had been revived after apparently dying. And he said that Plato took them seriously as indicators of an afterlife. Meanwhile, Democritus, who had came a little bit before, in his writings about this, says that this is just the residual biological activity of the body. Democritus had figured out that things are made up of tiny bits that are too small to see. Atomism was his contribution. And so he, he said this is just an artifact of the, even when the person seems dead, there's still biological activity. So the same debate we're having today, right? But I was, that was fascinating to me. Got interested in the question of life after death through Plato. Then in 1965, 3 years later, I met an actual living human being, Dr. George Ritchie, who had had such an experience. And since that time, I have, through my career as a Ph.D. in philosophy and a philosophy professor, then medical school, an MD, then into psychiatry, forensic psychiatry especially. And throughout that time, I've just continued to interview thousands and thousands of people who've had these astonishing experiences upon death. Now, I never fell for that thing. People are very threatened by this material. They don't know how to fit it into the Sunday school lesson or into the, the regime at the fire station. There's certain kind of relentless occupations. You don't have much time to think about life. I guess forensic psychiatry is one of them, actually. It's kind of constantly looking over your shoulder, afraid of being assaulted in a maximum security unit for the criminally insane. But I didn't ever accept that thing about oxygen deprivation to the brain. On philosophical grounds, first of all, nobody knows what the relationship between physical substance and consciousness is. In reality, people like to think they know, or so scared by not knowing something that they've got to think they know. But the fact is, we don't know. Okay, so Epiphenomenalism is a philosophical view that many people in neurosciences take, that consciousness is just an artifact of the real process, which they think it's the atoms and the molecules, the brain substance, and the electrochemical reactions. And so, but I did the oxygen deprivation thing doesn't fly. And I knew when my first year in medical school, one of my own medical school professors approached me and talked, and she said that she wanted to tell me about some mentation she had. She was a psychiatry professor, and I just loved that word. I want to talk to you about some mentation I had when I was resuscitating my mother. And so basically she talked about how, as her mother passed away, that she herself felt she lifted out of her body. She saw the scene from above. She saw her mother there with her now in spirit form. She saw her mother recede away into this tunnel and saw deceased relatives and friends of her mother's coming out to greet her. And so then they all receded into the tunnel, and my professor came back to her body. And I've heard hundreds of these shared death experiences. The same thing that we hear from people with near-death experiences who tell us about leaving the body and seeing the resuscitation, seeing apparitions of the deceased coming, going into a beautiful light, seeing life reviews. And this is, I guess, the most startling aspect of these shared death experiences to me is how many people I've heard from who say that as their loved one or a patient in one case was dying, that they themselves, the bystanders or the physician in this case, had these same, this life review. They empathically co-live the dying life review of the person who's passing away. Bystanders or physicians. And so obviously something more is going on than oxygen deprivation to the brain. So that's sort of more or less the drift of my work. I mean, people deserve to know whether I think there is a life after death. For years, I just don't know. For years, I would say because to satisfy people's curiosity, I will say this: I don't know what else to say than that there is life after death. If you ask me if I believe that there is life after death, I don't know what belief is. That sounds so bizarre, but I mean, once you start thinking, I'm a logician, a professor of logic, right? So, people think they know what they're talking about when they say belief, but they don't. And so I'm not, but what I gather about it is that people, how should I put this? I haven't internalized this. I gather that when people say they believe something, they're talking about some kind of internalization. That's not me. I can't say that it's internalized. And to me, it's still very counterintuitive. But nonetheless, I give up. I don't know what else to say. I have so many physician friends who have empathically co-lived the dying experiences of their patients and had these same experiences in the bed, or one wonderful man, an emergency room physician who talked to knew that the patient wasn't going to die because he talked to the patient's dead wife in the ER while the patient was having his near-death experience. I give up. Apparently there's an afterlife. I wouldn't try to persuade anybody else of that, but I'm not afraid of death. I'm terrified of a lot of things in life. I pray to God every day, please, no pain, just guide me gently through to a painless, peaceful, pleasant death on your schedule and comfort my kids, but I gather there is. So that's been my process. Yeah, I think the last time we talked, I didn't know what to say. But now I say, yeah, there is. And now that really focuses your attention on, well, what in the name of God is this place?
Well, let's talk a little bit more specifically about the phenomena that you have chronicled and evidenced around the stories that people relay, because there seems to be a body of experiences that are associated with the soul leaving the body in a conscious way, going through various experiences of light and tunnels and remembrances, a recapitulation of their lives. But give more texture to that. As you look back over nearly 50 years of hearing stories, what have been what have been the most unusual stories that you've heard, and how would you create is there a common experience that people have, or common categories within which these out of the body near death experiences fall?
Well, I seem to remember that you read Wittgenstein at one point, and had read that obviously as an analytic philosopher in my graduate career and professor career. And what Wittgenstein said is that general nouns, he said that it's not any one particular characteristic that all things that we call X have in common, but rather a pattern of characteristics like and so I think that not all of them have all of the characteristics.
Right.
And the way I've looked at it, there's about 15 or 20 common elements. And if you look at one particular story or account, that may have 2 or 3 or 4 of these things, or 7 or 8, sometimes people with extremely lengthy cardiac arrest that literally just don't make any sense. You know, some of my best friends are people who were blind. One case who was the doctor who's just totally changed this guy's life, Dr. Nelson, and his patient Vi, who was a good friend of mine, became a good friend of mine after her experience. But he said she was dead for 40 minutes. And in these cases where it goes on like that are the ones where people are most likely to see this whole full-blown picture, the 15 or 20. More typically, people with a briefer cardiac arrest, they'll tell you, I got out of my body, I went through a passageway, I began to see this light. People who have the full-blown picture will say, I got out of my body, I could see the resuscitation going down below. I could understand, not hear, but understand what the doctors and nurses and other people present were talking about. Then they say they go through a passageway of some sort, which they liken to a tunnel often, or a hallway. And they come out on the other side of that into this incredibly brilliant and warm and loving light. And they say, no matter how, whatever experience of light and love you've had in this world, there's just no way even to describe it. As a matter of fact, that's probably the most common thing people say, no matter how articulate. They say, I just can't describe it to you. You know, what I relate that to is, I'm sure you've read the great William James, his, Varieties of Religious Experience. And in his description of mystical experiences, he says that the most common characteristic of them is that people say, I just can't describe it. It's ineffable or indescribable. And people say that in that light, they encounter relatives or friends of theirs who have already passed away. They say you don't see a physical person, but you see nonetheless a form. And the people seem to be at the prime of life, no matter how old they were when they died. They just seem completely vital. And at the prime of life is a phrase I hear from people and translate. I remember a woman in France, first time I went there with this, the translator was saying, she's saying that everybody looked like they were in the prime of life. And so then to me, the most interesting part of this, Jim, are these life reviews. People say that time comes to a standstill. Everything else just kind of disappears. And you are surrounded by a holographic panorama, which consists of every single thing you've ever done. And that you see everything at once. And not only that, you see every action you've done, but when you see the action, you are empathically embedded in the consciousness of the person with whom you've interacted. So if you see yourself doing something mean to somebody, then you feel the sad feelings you brought about. Or conversely, if you see yourself doing something wonderful, sweet, kind to someone, you feel the good feelings. And so no wonder people come out of this. No matter, I learned quickly in my psychiatry residency that almost everybody seems to be chasing something. You'd hear these patients and, they want money, or they're chasing money, or they're chasing power, or they're chasing fame. And I just never, money, I'm on board with money, but I can't get my attention on that long enough to think about it. To me, the creative side is so just enthralling. But in the midst of all this, I went to my insight to my wonderful supervisor, John Buckman, and I said, John, something's wrong with me. It's like all these other patients, they're chasing something. They've got some specific, they're chasing money or power, or fame, or sex, or whatever. And I said, but I'm not chasing anything. I was kind of feeling like, is there some? And he smiled at me and he said, Raymond, how old were you when you finished your second doctoral degree? And I said, 31. And I got the point. I have spent my life chasing knowledge, see? But whatever people were chasing before they went through into this life review, they come out of this saying that what this is all about. David Stoney. Oh my God, how are you, David? Oh, wow. I'm sorry, I got the message here. David is on the, oh my God, David. And so I got the point that I spent my life chasing knowledge, and I don't regret that. I look back on my life and say, this is a very satisfying thing to study. So, however, even though people come back from this saying that the point of this life is to learn how to love, interestingly, it doesn't bring that into reality. It's like my friend George Ritchie said to me one time, he said, Raymond, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And George was the finest person I ever knew. And what he meant was, to put it in my crude terminology, let's face it, it's very difficult to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. Right? And that's the reality, and that doesn't change. But nonetheless, it does put people on this path. Now, after that life review, some people go on. Some people in the extremely lengthy cardiac arrest, people talk about glimpsing a layer of reality that's kind of superimposed right over this one that we're in now. And in there, you see these people who don't quite get it, that they're dead. And I heard this from people in Georgia back in the early 70s, early 70s. It's, very difficult to put into words. And I've lost the track of what was I talking about there?
Well, we're just talking about the different, you were mentioning about.
Oh, yeah. And so these people say that the ones with the extremely lengthy cardiac arrest, you can see that right in this thing we're in, all sort of superimposed over it, these people don't get it, that they're dead and they're repeating something. And these were people in Southern Baptists mostly that I was talking with in Georgia. And they didn't know about the classical tradition of that, right? Like in the Odyssey, book 11, with the people in the underworld, and they're repeating something like they're filling up the jars with water, but then they move them and the water drains out, or Sisyphus rolling the stone up and it comes back down. See, and then beyond that, even there are quite a number of people over the years have told me of glimpsing what can only be described, I guess, is a realm of knowledge. People say that you see into this place, and it's, George Ritchie said, and others have said the similar metaphor, like if you try to imagine Caltech and MIT and University of Virginia and Harvard and Princeton and Yale and all of it mixed up into one, you couldn't even begin to imagine this place. George said, at the age of 20, just barely graduated from college. He was a very smart guy. And George said that he saw into one aspect of this realm of knowledge, which consisted, he said, for want of a better term, you could call it like a library. And he said that one section of that library consisted of the holy books of the universe. Now, even beyond that, people who these are extremely lengthy cardiac arrests. They say that indescribably that there seems to be, they glimpse like a city of light is a current thing I hear. It's just like a whole civilization that doesn't seem to be composed of bone, like physical matter, but rather seems to be composed of something like sheer light. And so those are and then, you know, getting back, some people say, how did they get back? Some people say, I don't know how I got back. I was in that light. The next moment, I was back in my body on the operating table. I had no sense of transition. Other people say they were told they have to go back. There's things you got to do. Then there's others. And George said, and I'm thinking a lot about George lately. I don't know exactly why, but I remember him, you know, always saying that after this, you always have a kind of nostalgia, right? That you don't want to go back. They won't tell you why you got to go back. They say, yes, things left to complete. But then then often they get a guilt trip. You're like, well, why was this? I did something wrong or something. But I've known a lot of people long enough to realize that eventually they say, yeah, I figured out why I had to come back years later. And then a third group say that they were just given a choice. You can stay in this experience you're having, or you can go back to the life you were leading. And not too surprisingly, all of the ones I've known who were given that choice, you know, they chose to come back. And the most common reason is, I guess they say it's kids, right? They say, for me, I wanted to stay, but I had young kids left to raise, or some other loved one who was in bad situation that they felt like they had to go back for. And that's near that. Not everybody has. Some people may have 2 or 3 or 4 of those things, and 7 or 8. Some people have all of it. And that's the data we have to go on, which is stories, right? I just, you know, one difficulty in this whole field is that there really isn't any established rational method to study this kind of thing, because what we're dealing with is narratives, right? That's all we have to go on, is the stories of people. And when people get into this pseudoscientific framework, oh, we got to make this scientific, is that, how would I say this? It's, I think it's premature to talk about the question of life after death in 2021 as a scientific question. I said, I love science. I almost became an astronomer. I still follow science. I love science. And the fact is, there are some questions are not yet scientific. And one of the big ones is the question of life after death. How would you confirm or disconfirm that there's an afterlife? See, it's not yet articulated enough in a framework where we could confirm it or disconfirm it. Now, I think that is changed now, but I think that there is a major conceptual difficulty with it, which is that many people in this field that we're in, Jim, what really holds them to this subject is the stories, the narratives,
Sure.
which is, it is a receptive frame of mind, right? And that is why the paranormal is mostly entertainment, right? It's like, it's for entertainment purposes. So it's something for people do in their off hours, right? Unless you are very lucky to have a profession which can, you know, you can talk about this professionally, but for most people, it's a hobby or something they do on their off time. And so just from my sad experience in life, I've realized that, you know, there are many people who will sit still for hours and hours and hours and listen to your death experience stories. I am one of them, right? I mean, I've heard thousands of these. I can't wait to hear the next one. But Plato said in his Phaedo, he said, there's always, when you're trying to reason about life after death, there's always got to be a story attached to it. Because the notion is so obscure. Life after death, that phrase is a self-contradiction, really. I mean, it may bring beautiful pictures to our mind and good feelings, but when you try to specify what it means, you know, that's the difficulty. And so what Plato said is that you got to have a story, but even if you had a bazillion stories, that wouldn't add up to rational proof. What you need in addition is some set of concepts, right? And to link the experiential narratives with the statement that there's an afterlife. What people are doing now is they rush into science. Oh, let's make this scientific. Very often with little real awareness of what science is, but they just like the word, right? We got to make it scientific. But that's to jump the gun. The first question is not how can we prove this by science? The first question is what kind of means, what kind of method of rational investigation is needed? And it's the question in 2021, the reality is the question of life after death is not a scientific question, but it is a philosophical question. It's been, you know, it's one of the first philosophical questions and still unresolved. But the difficulty is, just from my personal experience, is that many times the same people who will sit still for hours and listen to the stories, the moment you start talking concepts, you see their eyes go up, you know, and you've lost them. And so that holds everybody in this very uncomfortable state where they go to the weekend workshop and they hear the charismatic, yes, there's an afterlife, and that makes them feel good. And they get that California look in their eyes and they go to the work week next Monday and everybody in the office is wondering why they're like this all of a sudden. Then by Wednesday and especially by Friday, it's kind of I'll worry about it again. So they have to go back the next weekend for another dose of the charismatic speaker. And that is just so useless and pointless. And at the age of 77, highly irritating to me because I want to make a statement which may seem incredible, but I'm not saying it to pat myself on the back or to propound a new belief system, but to issue a challenge. And that is that I, Raymond Moody, hereby claim that I have made a major breakthrough in the genuine, rigorous, rational investigation of questions of life after death. Not to praise myself, not to give a new belief, but rather to say I'm challenging you to see if you can find a flaw in this. You know, in a way, being a philosophy professor and a philosophy major even kind of ruins you for practical life because, you know, it's, I want to know what is. I really do. And what I'm saying is that we do now have a method to prepare people in advance by reformatting their mind in such a way that when subsequently they happen to have a near-death experience, they will come back and articulate it in a new way. Mm. And it's already happened. And so once we already have thousands and thousands of case reports of near-death experiences that are viewed through the lens of Aristotelian logic, right, which is predicated on literal meaning. And if you look at it that way, apparently the way you have to put it is as a travel narrative, all right? It's like I got out of my body, I went through a tunnel into a light, I saw my deceased relatives, and I came back to my body and I returned to life, right? That's a travel narrative, right? But they also say, but it wasn't in time. Time stood still, there was no time. And it wasn't in space, it was an aspatial realm, and I don't have any words for it. Well, one of my favorite stories about Abraham Lincoln was, I read this in junior high, I think, and I think it was in Carl Sandburg's biography. I'm not sure, but I don't remember what the occasion was, but it was a very solemn state ceremony. Everybody was gathered around in a very grave, serious mood. And Lincoln's part in the ceremony called for him to mount a horse and to lead a procession away from the scene. But when he got up on the horse put its own back hoof in the stirrup and got it caught. So the horse was bouncing around and everybody was shocked into silence. How embarrassing for the president and so on. So Mr. Lincoln just looked down at the horse and he said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And everybody just erupted into laughter. Now, if you think about it, what Lincoln said is nonsense, right? It's to say that a horse could get on its own back by putting the hoof in the stirrup and climbing, that's nonsensical. But you've got to admit it brings a very vivid image in your mind of that very movement. Okay, now, what that means is that these accounts of near-death experiences we have are a nonsensical travel narrative. That is what the structure of that kind of language is, which is all right. In the not too distant future, we're going to have other cases, stories of near-death experiences, which are articulated not just through the lens of literal meaning and logic, but rather through these new, in addition, these new rational principles. And that gives what we astronomers call parallax. You know, people always say, well, it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri, but have you ever stopped to think about how do they know that? Now, they can't send a homing pigeon out with an odometer, or how did they figure that one? Well, by the mid 1800s, roughly, they had the measuring was close enough so they could do what's called parallax measurements. And that is, imagine this. When the Earth is here in its orbit, they measure the angle to nearby stars very closely, wait exactly 6 months till the Earth is on the opposite side of the orbit, and they measured again, so you'd see there'd be a little difference, and that's called parallax. And that's how they tell for the stars about, I think it's out to about 10 parsecs or something like that. But now we have an equivalent method with these near-death experiences. We will have, by comparing the cases that were articulated through the Aristotelian scheme and these forthcoming cases, and one already, of people who have had this new way and learned about this new way of thinking, they'll be able to put this in an entirely new way. The one man it happened with is a very distinguished artist and scientist, just one of the most brilliant people. I mean, it's just like incredibly, and he went to one of my seminars on how to think about unintelligible things. Then several years later developed H1N1, lost his leg to gangrene, was in the hospital for 60 days. I think he had 3 cardiac arrests, but he said that Raymond, when I was over there on the other side, he said, my mind went back to the seminar, and he said, and I realized that what you're saying is true, that you can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account, was the way he put it. So we have new ways of doing this, but the difficulty is, see, that in order to get into this, you've got to go through a different thing than listening to stories. You've got to go through some conceptual reasoning. Incidentally, to my detriment almost, I am not a salesman type, but I do want to just talk just briefly about my book, published about 1.5 years ago or so by Llewellyn, is called Making Sense of Nonsense. And if you're interested in this, I have taught entire semester length courses in philosophy departments, psychology departments on how to think about nonsense. And the courses that I've used have these exercises in them that get the students have to learn a pattern of nonsense. Then they write some original examples of that. Then they have to reflect on how did that make me feel and so on. So if you're interested in doing this and reformatting your mind, then just pick up that book and you can work the exercises. And and then Levi, to everyone, pattern of nonsense, oxymoron. Thank you for that, because I had that very same thought, Ben, because see, common sense is wrong about nonsense. Matter of fact, one thing I can say, and I feel like, as close as I can prove anything, I can prove this, and that is that there is a sort of collective cognitive deficit that is in Western civilization, at least, which is caused by the fact that, number one, people love nonsense. If there's anybody old enough to remember doo-wop music, sha-na-na-na-na-na, combination of nonsense syllables with meaningful parts, or scat singing by Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, or playground rhymes. One bright day in the middle of the night, two dead boys got up to fight back to back. They faced each other, drew their swords, and shot each other. A blind man came to see the fray. A dumb man came to shout, hooray. A deaf policeman heard the noise and came and killed those two dead boys. Or Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss's books have sold over 600 million copies. What I'm getting at is the plain fact is people love nonsense, but they hate the word nonsense because they don't know what it means. It's like but anyway.
Well, Ray,
let me just say, in terms of Ben's question, it does sound, say, patterns of nonsense sounds oxymoronical, but listen to this, all right? 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. Now that's obviously nonsense, but now listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of whirling spontaneity. That's nonsense too, but it's a different type of nonsense than the first, right? Or listen to this, that cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. That's nonsense too, but yet a different type. Or hat thoroughly the if zoom how zest, or I've cataloged in my works over 70 different types of nonsense, each one of them having its own distinct effects on the mind. So thank you for the question, Ben. And it was already on my mind to say that because it's people are, and historically what happened is Plato was the first person to distinguish between the literal and the figurative, and he was the first person to define the notion of falsehood and to distinguish it from truth. Okay, so, and he was the one who kind of linked the true-false distinction with the literal mode of language, right? But Plato, in another one of his dialogues, was trying to figure out how to think logically about things that don't make sense. And he got quite a number of them, actually. He realized that one thing can be more nonsensical than another. And he realized that nonsense makes people laugh. And he realized that although it doesn't have any cognitive meaning, it nonetheless creates like a flow of imagery and so on in your mind. But Aristotle, as I gather from him, I think Aristotle was probably extremely obsessional. And so when it came to nonsense, that was a step too far for him. So Aristotle was probably very literal minded. So he let that go. His favorite word for nonsense was random talk. I could prove to you, and it'd take about 30 minutes, but I could prove to you that far from being random talk, nonsense is actually less random than ordinary meaningful language. One of the major mistakes in Western thought is people assume if this is the level of ordinary meaningful language here, wouldn't you agree that most people think of nonsense as something sublinguistic right down here that quite didn't make it? That's not correct. In reality, nonsense is a secondary accrual over the top of ordinary meaningful language. So it is actually something that is more complex in its structure than ordinary meaningful language. And so it's only when somebody just said about laughing gas and talking nonsense under laughing gas. Yeah, this was one of the things I had developed my scheme of how to classify different types of nonsense, beginning when I was 12 years old, actually, but a lot more work on it when I was graduate student, undergraduate and graduate student of philosophy, and then subsequently you just continued to work on it. So I already knew when I went to medical school about these different types of nonsense. So I remember one of my most jarring in a while, I mean, it wasn't unpleasant, but it was certainly a surprise, was when I started going on the wards and I saw that, first thing I realized was that sick patients talk nonsense, like people who are delirious will go on and on, it doesn't make any sense, or people who are intoxicated with mercury, for example, will talk nonsense. You mentioned laughing gas, or people who are schizophrenic will make up meaningless nonsense words, or people who are severely stressed, even if they're not injured, they can't put a sentence together. It's all nonsense. And so what my insight was that when people talk nonsense involuntarily because of an illness, the types of nonsense they talk are identically the same types of nonsense that Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and Shel Silverstein write deliberately, with the exception that I've seen a lot of nonsense writers who've come up with lots of different types of nonsense. I've never seen a sick patient come up with a type of nonsense that I hadn't seen in a writer, but I've seen plenty of types of nonsense with writers that I've never seen with patients. So what that indicates to me is that the nonsense as the creative aspect of it is a more broader thing than the pathological dimension of it.
Good. Well, thank you for that. It's an insight into how we understand these near-death experiences and these mysterious phenomena that you've been tracking. I'd like to turn to two other subjects. First, there's a lot of similarities between people through these experiences that you're recounting, and children and people that remember past lives.
Yeah.
So that not only do people have the experience of moving through death into another kind of world, but people also have the experience of remembering back to world behind the near-death experience when they actually went through the passage to the other side. And I'm just wondering, Ray, what your own thinking or how you would connect the body of research that you've been developing over these decades with the phenomenon of the transmigration of souls, which, as you know, Plato and the Greeks and the ancient world believed in, and the whole phenomenon of reincarnation, because that's also part of the myth of Ganges there in the Republic and other stories.
That's right.
Both ancient and modern. How do you understand this phenomenon?
Well, first thing I want to say as a general, pre-warning is I am not a parapsychologist. I think parapsychology is a pseudoscience, okay? And it's just enjoying the word science is what parapsychology is all about. But and so I knew and loved Ian Stevenson, and Ian was a friend of mine, okay? And I'm not, he's passed away now, but I'm not talking behind his back, because I would say this to his face. And I would say, Ian was one of the least capable people in critical thinking that I have ever met in my life. Ian, his idea of scholarship was that if you got the footnotes right, then everything was okay, right? And also, as long as you said something that went along with his pre-existing belief, I think his family was theosophist, then it was okay. But Ian Stevenson's work on reincarnation, no, I don't trust. like I said, that's
But as setting aside the particular work
yeah,
of
yeah. Well, then
particular author,
now to
as
get
a
to my
general
point,
phenomenon,
there you go. There,
I
let me
think
get.
there's a
You're
relationship
absolutely right.
between
You're
near-death
right.
experiences at the end of one's life toward
Yes.
some unknown, and to be able to remember
Yeah.
back to previous incarnations, as it were, which means that both at the front end and at the back end,
Yeah.
there's a porousness to previous incarnational forms
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me
relative.
tell you how I got there, Jim. And that is that I just didn't know, but I just, as you know, I have two wonderful kids adopted at birth. And also, Cheryl and I don't go to religious things. We don't talk about life after death. We talk about the phone bill, the dinner, but these kids, both of my adopted kids, have told me, just like out of nowhere, told me about their previous lives, but in such a way that I can't deny that what they said was true. Like, like Carter, for example, when he was 3, just had a no, he's I'm sorry, 5. Out of nowhere said, started talking about his mom and dad in China, where he lived with his brothers and sisters. What? And he said, yeah, Dad. And he could tell, that I was baffled. So then, as though to orient me, he said, yeah. And then I was up in the trees looking at you and Mommy down in the grass. And I knew exactly what he was talking about because Cheryl and I were in Greece at this archaeological site, and we were exhausted. So the attendant said, just go over there, lie in the grass and take a nap. And there were these big trees all around. And we were talking about adopting a baby. That's where the process started. It ended up of getting Carter. Now I give up. And Carol Ann, my Native American dog, the same deal. So, but more than that, it makes sense. The big question in philosophy that impinges on the afterlife question is the question of personal identity.
Yes.
What is it that your personal identity consists of? It was like it was before Plato. There were these other people, Pythagoras and all, but it was really Plato who made it official. The immaterial, immortal soul is the essence of your personal identity, and the body is a sort of flux and flow, a kind of unreal, illusory thing. And where I have come on this, there was a long history in this. Eventually, they realized that the notion of an immaterial soul was hard to comprehend. So I think it was John Locke who first made it your memories are the essence of your personal identity, right? But David Hume said, when I look in myself, I don't see any substrate, right? All I see is the temporary impressions. And that's kind of what a lot of modern psychology thinks, that the self is a kind of illusion. But here I am, I'm just stating without going through my process, but what I think is that this thing we're in is like a theater. These are the movies. For a year, I had the wonderful experience when I was a psychiatry resident of being the oldest resident, because I'd been through another education and career path first. Plus, I was known for the book. And so, in a small town, you've got the mayor and the chief of police and the city council and the local celebrities. They can't show up at the front door of the mental health clinic like the rest of us peons, right? They have to be taken around the back. And I was it for a year. And it was so wonderful. These very generally elderly, this was the geriatric part, the geriatric section. And very distinguished and very articulate, and mostly there because they were lonely, as I figured, or, just situational stress or something. And repeatedly during that time, I heard this people say, Raymond, the older I get, the more, when I look back at my life, I developed this kind of strange impression. It can't shake the feeling that it's kind of a play or a movie or a drama, different words, And, so this is part of development. And so now so what I think is this is theater. I mean, we live through the story. What is your life but story? Think of your consciousness. Consciousness is narrative directed, right? What happens to you when you have a new event in your life is that your mind automatically brings it into the life story, right? Adds on to the life story. I think it's the Kulnikov effect. I can't remember, but cinematographers have a principle that if you give any two randomly chosen images and present them in sequence to the person, then the mind automatically starts spinning a story to connect them. That's just how we are. And the way I gather is that we go through this story and then we go through some incomprehensible process and then we're back on another storyline.
Let's talk a minute, Ray, about the technology of accessing communication with those who have passed. And I'm thinking of your work with mirrors, and the ancient Greek, Roman, and in China. There's been different technologies that both ancient and modern societies have developed for actually intentionally communicating with the dead, with the ancestors. And that's obviously what the necromantians were in ancient Greco-Roman times, or specific sites that people would journey to, and they would go through processes. I know that you set up sort of apparatuses to enable that. So it's one thing to see this as happening kind of circumstantially to some people and not others, but there's also been the development of actual technologies that enable people intentionally to go into this realm of nonsense, but communicate with people on the other side. So talk to us a little bit about how the ancients did it and your experimentation to do it, and what you learned.
Well, you know, and all my good friends know that I am a boring person because everything to me goes back to the Greeks, right? And I mean, that's the way I've been since I was 18. And I remember reading Herodotus at age 18. And I remember exactly where I was. And I remember the mood that this cast over me. And it was about, Herodotus talks about this king who had lost something. And so he sent a delegation to the oracle of the dead among the Thesprotians on the river Acheron, where you and I have been, and to go to the oracle of the dead and to call up his wife to get the information they needed, or he needed. And so I remember thinking specifically, the disappointment I felt with Herodotus, who I greatly admired, to think that he would fall for something like, I thought it had to be a legend. Flash forward, that was 62, flash forward 1985. I keep up with the classical journals, and I read an article about the rediscovery of the most famous of the oracles of the dead. And based on what the archaeologists found, which was an enormous bronze cauldron in a darkened chamber underground surrounded by a banister with carbon marks from the torches on the wall. And I said, I know what that is, because I'd already known, as from my interest in altered states, that even today they do this in the Middle East. You take a silver bowl, you highly polish it on the inside, fill it up with olive oil. In a darkened room by candlelight, you gaze into it and people see visions. And and this is not just the Greeks. This was a folk custom in the United States and Britain up until the year 1915 is the last. It was everybody knew it in the 1900s and 1800s and early into the 1900s. Everybody knew this. Why did it stop? I figure it was probably radio and then TV. I mean, people lost track with these things that they used to do. But basically, you can set up an optical clear depth. I did it in a chamber, darkened chamber in my room, put a mirror on the wall, you put a chair in front of it. So when you look up, you don't see reflections. It's a darkened room. There's a candle or a dim lamp behind you. And the preparation is the most important things, which I also read about in the ancient accounts is like, it's like you, as though you were doing grief counseling or something, like, who tell me, you get people to choose one person they want to talk to again. It's like, tell me about this person. What are your best memories? What were the sticking points and so on? And after they get that, you take them in there. And under those circumstances, about 60% of the people, even on the first attempt, will have some sort of experience that they interpret to be a communication with the dead. And this was really the most startling thing about this. I knew it would work just because, I just knew it would work when I read it. It made sense. But since my initial subjects on this were my colleagues, my medical colleagues, my psychological colleagues, my graduate students of psychology, many of whom had already been out as counselors, but were just coming back from more education. And so it just never entered my mind that they would say anything other than, yeah, I saw this image. It looked like my grandma, but was it real or was it? I don't know. But the most troubling part of this to me in a way was that people, my friends were going there, yeah, not that I saw an image of my father, but I saw my father. I talked to my father. It's interpreted to be a real event, which is startling. People say it's not dreamlike at all, but they actually feel like they're in contact with the person. I don't know what to make of that, because my interest is really in, to me, all this stuff is just something I do because people enjoy it. And so when I have my free time, I work on philosophy of language and logic and ancient Greek philosophy, which are my main. That's the context in which I see all this.
Yeah, but it opens up, these near-death experiences, afterlife experiences, reincarnational experiences, gazing into a bowl or a mirror and communicating. What it brings up, I think, for me, Ray, and I think for most people, is that our universe, our world, is very multidimensional, and there's layers and layers and layers of living intelligence and life forms. And at some occasions where we go through, even taking psychotropic plants, where you alter your consciousness, all of a sudden the permeability of the universe becomes much more accessible to you. And to me, it's a comforting thing to realize that this little world of ours of time, space, and causality, and Zoom, and you there and me here, and it's all bounded by sort of concrete manifestation and unmovable, is actually really porous.
Yes.
Actually very, very porous. And with just a glance here, or an intention there, or a technology there, or a memory, you can activate the multidimensionality of life, that it's actually a very many splendored thing, not just as narrow as we've been taught about.
I have that same astonishment that you talk about there, Jim. To me, I think maybe 10 years ago, there was a very accurate count most accurate count ever of the known number of stars in the known universe. And if I recall correctly, as I translated all the zeros, or either, I think it was 150 billion trillion stars in the known universe. And from the Kepler, we're beginning to see that practically all of them have planets, right? And so let's say that the sun is an outlier in having 8, but that the average star has only 4. Okay, but that's still 600 billion trillion planets in the known universe. And according to the Kepler, again, they estimate that somewhat more than 1 in 1,000 of exoplanets are Earth-like. So that means on the order of 1 billion trillion Earths.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so wonderful. You got to hand it to God that in all that vastness, he and Jesus are up there pacing the floor and biting their nails because a couple of gay guys live down the street. You know, and what I'm getting at here is, yes, it's so vast. And to me, religion is a way that people have of simplifying this so they don't have to face it seems to be a scary thing for some people. To me, it's exciting.
Yeah. We limit God, we limit the great
Yeah,
avatars, we limit ourselves by not opening ourselves up to the great mystery that is happening all around us.
yeah.
And you're right. Yeah, I hadn't.
Everything's a mystery, Jim.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
I think it was, I forgot who, it's the French dramatist who said, nonsense is the end result of all sense. And I realized that as a kid. No matter how prosaic or simple, seemingly obvious something is the moment you start analyzing it, you quickly get into things that don't make any sense at all. Like when I went to the CIA not long, it was a few years ago, actually now, but one of my students was there as agent or whatever they call them, and he was talking about he had a class of mine in 1969 at East Carolina University, and then he had gone on to law school and he worked for the agency, and he said that his life, conscious life, effectively began in that course when he said, the first thing I said in the class is, well, how many of you walked from the dorm? Well, wouldn't you agree that in order to get from your dorm to here, you had to go half the distance? Yeah. Yeah. Well, in order to get to the halfway point, don't you have to get half that way first? Yeah. Well, then to get to that point, you have to do one half and one. How do you ever get started? And that young man, and that's how these philosophical problems do you. It's things that seem obvious are not obvious. As soon as you start analyzing anything, you quickly get to the unintelligible. But we don't have to stop there anymore. When something is proven unintelligible in science, the idea is that there's no further inquiry to be done. That happens to be false because in reality, nonsense is a placeholder in science. That is, when a singer forgets the words, they fill in till they can remember again with nonsense syllables. I've seen Elvis do it, for example. And similarly, and if you look at the history of science, when people were striving for something and they knew it didn't make sense, but they hold on to the nonsense as a sort of stopgap or inquiry mechanism. And I guess the famous example right now is if you integrate the equations of general relativity and quantum theory, which are the two strongest physical systems ever devised, or physical theories ever devised, then the end result is nonsense, right? The integration of the two sets of equations is unintelligible. And so in reality, unintelligible language is a stopgap in or placeholder in science. Many examples of it. The history of chemistry, for example, is here full of really wonderful examples of that.
Well, Ray, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
shedding light on this deep mystery. And you're so right. In the end, these are narratives, and we love to hear them.
Yeah.
We love to hear them. Just in the chat right now from Amanda Faulkner, she says that she had a life-saving surgery 4 years ago with a near 100% mortality rate after being left for dead. And then she was held by an older woman on the other side and guided back to her body. And when she got back to her body, she was reborn. I mean, these stories,
every one
right,
of them is
at
amazing.
one level, they're nonsensical because they don't make any real rational sense.
That's
but
right.
at another level, they inspire us to hope and to a sense of connectedness to a larger whole. And I
Yeah.
think that's really the point, is the connectedness to a larger
Glossolalia,
whole.
nonsense is a powerful spiritual modality. Koans,
Yeah.
glossolalia, there's others as well. I've tried glossolalia. You don't need to be religious or in the ceremony. You just start. It's nonsense syllables drawn from your own language, put together with no meaningful combinations. And you don't need an ecstatic state to start it. But once you do that for a while, you get into a really startling altered state. I can easily imagine how that kind of altered state of consciousness might very well open somebody up to the presence of God. I mean, it's, yeah.
Well, you've opened us up to the presence of God, Ray, today, and I thank you for it. And I think everyone, on the call and the larger community watching today is enthralled, as we always are when we're taken to the portal of mystery. So thank you very much, my friend.
Thank you. And how wonderful to hear through this from David Stoney. And if you have any way of getting my phone number to David, I would appreciate it.
So. Yeah, David, check in with me and I'll connect you up with Ray.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again on Monday. On Monday, we're going to turn to a subject a little bit more mundane, and that is within the context of nonsense of our world, the chaos of our world. How do you develop strategy? So we're going to start with the nonsense and then see how we can make sense.
Right.
We're always going backwards and forwards, Ray, one way or another. That's the great Tao. So thank you so much, Ray. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys, and everybody listening in. Thank you all so much for this. I'm just so grateful to have somebody to talk with about this stuff. So I just appreciate your listening. I wish I had a way of getting face to face.
Yeah, well,
thank you so
much. Post-COVID. All right, my friend. Be well. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. We'll see you again on Monday. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.